Hello, everyone, and welcome to the conference session for today. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Elena Gautier-Mamarill's paper, Cartesian Dualism, Cripping Autonomy with the Filipino Concepts of Lube and Capua. I apologize if I mispronounced those words, and I'm sure the correct pronunciation will be given to us shortly. Elena's research focuses on the link between individual and collective power through the analysis of political affect in Spinoza. And she tries to apply Spinoza's grid to public health policies that structure patient participation, particularly in mental health services in the UK. She is a PhD graduate from the University of Aberdeen in philosophy, and her areas of specialization include the history of philosophy, 17th to 18th century, ethics, applied ethics, and especially bioethics, relational autonomy theory, and feminist philosophy. She also is the author of a podcast, which I thought was very interesting, and I hope to have a listen to that as soon as our enrollment period isn't driving me crazy as chair of a department. Together with Iva Apostolova, Elena has published an article entitled Care and the Self, a philosophical perspective on constructing active masculinities. As I say, again, it's my great pleasure to introduce Elena, and again, her paper is entitled Skipping Cartesian Dualism, Cripping Autonomy with the Filipino Concepts of Lube and Capua. Take it away, Elena.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'll do my best to slow down my usual speed for the captioning. My name is Elena Gautier-Mamarill. I am currently a postdoctoral research and teaching fellow at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And thank you very much, Julie, for that intro. I realize now I should probably update my website. Yes, I've finally completed my PhD working on Spinoza, but I will not be presenting Spinoza to you today. What I will be presenting is a work in progress that I am doing examining Filipino philosophy. So to give you a bit of context, I came to Filipino philosophy. Oh, first of all, I should describe myself. I am a light-skinned, half Asian, half white woman with short, curly, dark hair, and I am currently wearing a yellow and pink sweater. So I am half Filipina, and I came to examine Filipino philosophy towards the end of my PhD because I was already working on some kind of weird Spinoza, relational autonomy, feminist theories, bioethics to look at the UK policies in shared decision-making in healthcare. So I was reading a lot of feminist theory on relational autonomy and feeling kind of frustrated. And I think I just decided to see, like, okay, are there other approaches to relationality that are not captured within this kind of very narrow Western analytic feminist lens? And I came upon some really interesting concepts in Filipino philosophy. So what I would like to do today is just present a couple of these concepts and kind of show how they can be generative and fruitful when trying to develop a philosophy of disability, and how I find that these resonate with intuitions that are happening in my own research in the philosophy of disability. So I'm not going to present a fully formed argument today. Rather, it will be more look at this, look how cool this is. And maybe this can spark some ideas with people. And I would be very happy to ask your questions and kind of use this as an opportunity to broaden all of our scopes today. So I will share my screen now. So hopefully that is visible to everyone. All right, so I very ambitiously titled this presentation, Skipping Cartesian Dualism, Cripping Autonomy with the Filipino Concepts of Loob and Kapwa. I will be upfront and say I am in the middle of a flare-up at the moment of my ME, my myalgic encephalomyelitis. So there might be delays in my verbal cognitive processing today, but basically I will present to you the background that would allow us to develop an idea of cripping autonomy with Filipino concepts today. So a brief outline of my presentation. So first of all, I'll speak to you about the stakes of why should we care about this, what is at play, give you very, very brief historical and conceptual parameters. And then I'll delve more into what Loob and Kapwa are and how I relate that to the both and relational selfhood that one can find in critical disability studies and in queer theory as well. I will address some thorns, some objections about how this relates to submissiveness to oppressive norms. This will be my way of kind of engaging some objections that come specifically from Western feminist relational autonomy theory. I'll briefly present my counter-argument and my conclusion. So, first of all, why Filipino philosophy? So, when I first came upon a paper that was I was specifically looking at virtue and power in Spinoza, and I came about Jeremiah Reyes's 2015 paper on Loob and Kapwa, and it made this really compelling argument that there is something about the trajectory, the historical, sociocultural trajectory of thought in the islands that are called the Philippines that can really help us elucidate or shed light on concepts that are taken for granted in Western philosophy. So I'm going to explain a little bit what I mean by that. And then I'll also address how this is relevant specifically to the philosophy of disability. So there are consequences to skipping Cartesian dualism. So to be clear, when I talk about Cartesian dualism, I talk about specifically René Descartes' idea that a mind and a body are two different substances, but I also am talking about the overall uptake in the literature, in science, in politics in the West that has kind of embraced this idea of separation between mind and body. And this is something that is critiqued a lot in feminist theory, feminist philosophy, and I believe has very good place as well in philosophy of disability. So why do I say that it is skipping Cartesian dualism? I'll explain that in a minute. But the fact that Filipino thought was not exposed to the same kind of trajectory as the West means that it has different emphasis. So it has an emphasis on the relational. It values intuition much more, and in many ways that are maybe not overt, resists Western logic. So I see these all as generative attitudes that can help us to rethink autonomy and agency, especially in the context of a philosophy of disability. So because of these different emphasis on relationality, for example, there is a lot of possibility in Filipino philosophy to critique reason and or reason-centered discourse. So what I mean by this is we, and I include myself, having been trained in Canada and in the UK, are trained in a way that centers reason in philosophy in a very narrow and specific way. So I think that a critique of reason or of this kind of narrow understanding of reason is something that is happening in philosophy of disability. And this is something that Filipino philosophy can help us look at. For the same reasons, it's a less familiar space to explore the tension between individuality and relationality. Again, because I have been looking at relational theory and relational autonomy specifically, I have noticed that there is a way in which contemporary analytical feminists especially must contend with the individualism of liberalism and neoliberalism throughout the history of Western thought when they are critiquing autonomy. And I realized this because I was working on Spinoza, who obviously was historically, chronologically prior to all of these developments and did not approach the topic in the same way. And I found that looking into Filipino philosophy was also a way to say, hey, how can we explore this topic in a completely different, or maybe not completely different, but different enough conceptual space? And that can help us rethink agency. So I will now go into the historical and conceptual parameters. So I'll briefly talk about the kind of chronological approach that one can use when looking at this topic, and explain as well a conceptual conundrum. So the chronological approach would be to say that there are identifiable movements in Filipino history of thought that can explain why there would be a different approach to individuality and agency. And now I want to preface this by saying this is not meant to represent all of Filipino philosophy, if that is even possible. So I don't want this to contribute to like further essentializing of kind of indigenous thought as well. But I do think that it is interesting to look at the broad arc of history. And I think that there are enough people here who are familiar with history of philosophy and thinking that it's not necessarily about seeing a linear development of thought, but rather kind of identifying the social cultural parameters and normativities that arise in certain spaces. So when we look at the history of the Philippines, so we can talk about grossly kind of a pre-colonial existence. Again, pre-colonial to what? There have been lots of journeys between the Malaysian islands, the Indonesian islands, China, etc., Japan, the Philippines, generally we talk about pre-European colonization. So there is evidence of indigenous thought that endures through myths and worldviews today. So there are still kind of a more sociological, mythological approach to tribal pre-colonial concepts. Now, again, this is not about trying to excavate something that is quote unquote pure. It is about looking at indigenous concepts that have evolved, but are still claimed and identifiable as indigenous. Then in the 16th century, we had the Spanish colonizers invade, and they imported Thomism mostly. Okay, so this is what's important here. So the Spanish stay for 300 years. And this means that the shape of philosophy and intellectual thought is mostly given by Aristotelians and scholastics, or people trained in that area. And the major education centers are directed by Dominican brothers and Jesuits, two different factions of the Catholic Church. So we have a very specific kind of shaping of what philosophy is through that. And this means that there wasn't a kind of British German revolution kind of in the 18th century, and they didn't follow the trajectory of Kantianism, etc., and all of these things for a long time. And Cartesian dualism was not a main focus at all until the late arrival of American individualism, when the Americans took over from the Spanish to colonize the islands. And the Americans brought Protestantism with them and brought a very different kind of intellectual tradition. So what I will be presenting today is a couple of concepts that are relevant to agency, that have their roots in indigenous thought, have been shaped by a specific kind of colonizing scholasticism, and that is in a way at odds with a lot of American individualism. So the problem is there is no consensus about whether or not there is such a thing as Filipino philosophy. I think this is a very interesting topic that I do not have enough time to delve into right now, but briefly, it comes down to what counts as philosophy. Should we be looking for specific narratives of philosophy? And there are very broadly two camps. So there are people who say, no, there is no such thing as Filipino philosophy. We have literature, we have sociology, but there is a lack of systematicity, a lack of universal principles, and a disinterest in logic and other abstract pursuits, even in relation to other Asian countries and Asian traditions. So a lot of arguments will come up being, the Confucian Analects describe a desire to kind of study logic, even if it's different from Western logic. The same thing with classical Indian philosophy. There is no such thing that is properly Filipino in the exercise of systematic thinking. And then there are people who, like the late Emerita Quito, who would say that if we're looking at the basis of what philosophy is as a love of wisdom, then Filipinos do have a philosophy of life, and what Emerita Quito calls a Filipino Volksgeist, or spirit of the people, or diwa in Tagalog. So what Quito means by this is that the fact that Filipinos do not have a record of systematic philosophy does not mean at all that they do not question and theorize and pass on as cultural value their place in the cosmos, their relation to one another, that they do not have ethical principles, that they do not have an idea of philosophy of politics. But it is very much a practical philosophy. It is a philosophy that does not distinguish so much between theory and practice. There's this idea that a philosophy is about how we live, how one lives a good life, and one's attitude towards one's place in the cosmos. Okay, so it's this idea that, yes, of course, concepts are shared and created through language, through shared mythology, and all of these things, but that does not make it less philosophical. So I will be operating under the second assumption that there is a Volksgeist, or a philosophy of life, that even if it is not at the moment systematized, still has a lot of important things to show us. So I will now proceed to talk about Loob and Capua separately, and then related to how this is relevant to the kind of both and stance in critical disability studies and philosophy of disability. So Loob can be translated in many ways. Most people translate it as inside, but Reyes, the author I mostly based this on, makes the argument that this can be tricky because it kind of invites us to think of inside outside as like the self, the other. And Loob in the literature resists this kind of dichotomy. So I might slip as I speak to you all today, but I'm going to try and avoid referring to the self when speaking of Loob, because that's not the image that the concept that Loob represents. So Loob is about whatever we want to call, personhood, interiority, agency, individuality. All of these things are true in a sense, but I'm going to try and avoid using the self or the individual, just to try and help us get out of that framework, so to speak. So Loob resists that interior-exterior dichotomy, and it is fundamentally embodied. So there's never a concept of the Loob being just the soul or just the mind. So even though there can be mythologies about a soul, it does not mean that the Loob is not embodied. The Loob is always embodied, always situated, and directed towards others. And if you allow me, I will import another word from Scots, from one of the languages spoken here in Scotland, which is ut with, so out with. So I will say that Loob is directed ut with of myself. It is always a direction towards otherness, openness, however we want to define that. And it cannot be conceived separately from Capua, which I will speak about in a moment. Or in other words, it can only be known through interaction. So if we're thinking about it as the seat of agency, the seat of identity and of the self, it is something that can only be understood and known through its interaction with otherness. All right, so there is no singularized introspection, self-reflection in a void, in a vacuum, to know like who I am. It is only through interaction, through my relation with others and otherness, that one can know loob. And loob is part of a whole slew of Tagalog and Visayan and Cebuan expressions, okay? And I don't have time to go through all of them, but a lot of them will describe a kind of debt of gratitude towards one another, a way of togetherness. So loob is a word that you will find in many, many expressions because it can't really stand on its own. Now, I say that loob cannot be understood without kapwa. So kapwa can be understood as togetherness, together with the other. Some people add together with the other person, but Reyes again makes a compelling argument that it is not necessarily limited to human togetherness. It is about one's relationship to nature, one's relationship to the universe and the cosmos in general. And it is fundamental. So in other words, when thinking about identity and agency, the ontological foundation is relationality with the cosmos. It is not about knowing myself, then knowing myself in the cosmos. It is about knowing myself through knowing the cosmos and my place in it. Okay, so that is the foundation upon which we can then start discussing what is ethics, what is politics. And finally, Kapwa will also emphasize that we must preserve rather than destroy relations, or we must strive to preserve rather than to destroy. Okay, so that is another point that can be thorny, and we'll look into that in a moment. But it's this idea that relationality is not only a given, it is a fundamental good. Okay, so whether or not we agree with certain types of relations comes after. The first stance is that relationality is not only ever present, it is what we need to invest in to survive and to flourish. So how does this relate to the philosophy of disability? So as I just mentioned, it includes this idea of a dynamic conception of the self that assumes radical and extra-personal, so extra-human relationality. It also interestingly positions interdependence as a goal rather than as a moral failing. So it is maybe skewed in that direction, and whether or not it's skewed too far, we can discuss. But it's this idea that it is quite the opposite of saying, the more I am autonomous and self-sufficient, the more I am a moral or a good person or a person of good standing, that I'm not being a burden, etc. That kind of logic doesn't work here. Interdependence is the goal. We want to keep investing in relations, and it to the point where things that are viewed as destroying relations are socially shunned and deemed to be ethically bad. And then finally, I wanted to bring in the lakas ng loob, or bahala na. So what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting is that although traditional indigenous Filipino beliefs are generally polytheistic, they also differ from other Asian populations or traditions, in the sense that in that polytheism, the gods are personal. So even before the arrival of the Spanish and the imposition of Catholicism and Christianity in general, Filipinos have an idea of a personal God, okay? And Bahala Na is an expression that kind of is leaving it up to providence, so to speak. And I believe there's a lot of scope to explore this as an existential posture that is compatible with crypt time. So the idea of crypt time as something that disrupts the not only the linear chronological idea of time, but also resisting the idea of progress and constant betterment, if you will, of the progression of time. So I think the Bahala Na and the belief in the kind of wheel of fortune of saying no state exists forever. And so we can build a kind of resilience from knowing that if I'm in a bad place now, eventually we'll get better. If I'm in a good place, I can't assume I will stay there forever. So it's this idea of non-linear time that relates much more broadly than my own personal experience, but really my relationship to my community and to the universe in general. So it's this idea that my relational selfhood or my relationality, I am both present now and always in movement that is not linear. Okay, it's not if I am a good person, I will achieve good things, I deserve to get rewards. It's the idea that if I do a good thing now, the universe might still make it hard for me tomorrow. It's this idea that I cannot count on a steady progression of development. So, some thorns. So there are a couple of things that can come up, and maybe some of you have already thought about this, but these are objections that are largely raised to many communitarian type theories that what about if the relation is oppressive? Okay, so there are criticisms of this attitude of Bahala Na as far back as the Spanish colonial period, definitely present during the American occupation of, the Indios, which is what they would call them, like the native Filipinos are too trusting and too submissive, and they're too generous. And this is considered to be a vice of laziness and not being able to put their self-interest at the forefront and not having the kind of mental acuity of being able to see an opportunity and exploit it for their own gain. So obviously, we can take those criticisms with a grain of salt because it carries a lot of colonial attitudes. But there is a real danger in the idea of what if this emphasis on relationality is really all about supporting normativity and normative behaviors that create vulnerabilities, etc. And is there a difference between choosing relationality and avoiding confrontation? And literally, they have an expression that's do not rock the boat, of being like, for the sake of community union and harmony, I might do things and say things that I don't believe in because I do not want to destroy relations. So I don't have any firm firm solution to this. But what I will say is that, first of all, resilience is not the same as a lack of resistance. So a lot of criticisms of Bahala Na will say that, oh, it's a fatalism. It's like, oh, there's nothing I can do. The wheel of fortune will turn. And I think that is too simplistic a way of examining it. And I mean, historically, it is false that native populations in the Philippines have not taken arms, have not resisted invaders, have not participated in political debates. So, I mean, empirically, it is false that, you know, the Filipino people are this kind of, whatchamacallit, sorry, words, stereotype of a submissive population. Okay, so I want to, in my own research, and I urge other people to think about, you know, being resilient. And I think this is valuable also when speaking to other members of the disability community, that resilience is not the same as lack of resistance. And also, thou shalt check your reason-centered yardstick. So, I mean, I'm saying this because I want to be careful of it myself and not perpetuating kind of colonial attitudes of saying, well, you know, they weren't able to see the reason in this, or they didn't use reason in their community proceedings. And, you know, the reasonable thing would be to oppose this social relation. I think it's much more complicated than that, and we must keep that in mind when analyzing different thoughts and thought traditions. And I think in general, the philosophy of disability is used to dealing with vulnerabilization. So yes, is it a problem that to maybe overemphasize relationality writ large? Sure, absolutely. I don't think this should stop us from investigating. And I don't think we should try and find a kind of, again, magical solution in different areas of thought, but rather see how they can become engaging conceptual partners in trying to develop a philosophy of disability. So in conclusion, because of its radical commitment to relationality and dynamic out with existence, a Filipino philosophy can be an engaging conceptual partner to philosophy of disability. They both are concerned in their own way with resisting atomistic individualism and a linear conception of development and reason, and can therefore support one another in developing CRIP agency. Thank you very much. And you'll see there a selected bibliography.
Thank you very much, Elena, for that wonderful presentation. I don't see any questions yet from Shelley, so please, everyone, please go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A for Elena. In the meantime, I'd be happy and honored to go ahead with a question, if I may. What is that? The right of the chair to ask a question that people always refer to. Your presentation was fascinating and really hit home for me, because I use traditional African philosophy in my own work on disability, and saw echoes of a lot of the same themes, and also the debates over. I remember the first course I taught on African philosophy was completely about what is African philosophy and whether it counted as a real philosophy. Fortunately, we've moved beyond that debate, but I wondered if you could say a bit more about what, so going forward, building on what you presented today, about how you see these concepts developing in relation to CRIP theory and philosophy of disability, and how you think they would be most useful in that theory.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, continuing in my work, I will be engaging with a bit more of like a wider variety of concepts as well. And as I've mentioned in passing, there are these things about like debt of gratitude, or this idea of building relationship, building community in a wide variety of ways. So there is actually specific concepts about how one builds community with close family members, with people from other villages, from all of these things. And I mean, for me, it will also be important to study kind of the history of uh, disability studies in the Philippines and attitudes towards that. So not just kind of importing crip theory from the West and seeing how they intersect, but seeing like how kind of the history of thought in general in the Philippines has affected that. What I'm interested in, as I mentioned, I'm a Spinozist. I also found this concept of bait, which is basically explains Spinoza's third kind of knowledge. So the kind of knowledge that most Western Spinozists like to pretend does not exist, because it's this weird thing where you have intuition of essences, and they're like, that's not rational. And I'm like, but I now found this concept that basically is saying the same thing. So I want to like, I'm really interested in deconstructing rationality. That's a lot of what my work is. And so I can see myself pursuing that angle, definitely. But I've also found fascinating parallels with, shared concepts between the Philippines and Indonesia, for example, and how the effects of Christianity in the Philippines and Hinduism and Islam in Indonesia have like taken those concepts in like different directions. So I think there's a lot to do with the reception, this idea of reception. And there's also this idea that there is no quote unquote original philosophy done in the Philippines today, because it is all imported from whatever school the professors have been. So there are like specific universities that are very, Anglo-American pragmatists. Some people are like Heideggerian phenomenologists. Some people are like hardcore Thomists. And there's this idea that, oh, we can just kind of import these ideas and they're not new. And I think that's false. I think, sure, you can have schools of thought, but the very fact that they're being done in a completely different context, and that the people who are philosophers and training to be philosophers in the Philippines now are not, 19th century German white men, makes it different. And I'm really inspired by the work of Jimena Sole in Argentina, who is working on German idealism and its reception in Argentina and South America in general. And this idea that we have to rethink either it's this pure indigenous philosophy, or it's just a pale copy of European and American philosophy. So I think I'm going to investigate those.
Well, thank you very much. We have a question from Morgan, and I'll just, pardon me, read the question. The critique of reason and agency and of the neuronormative, oh, hang on, it moved. I have to scroll back up to find it. Okay, and of the neuronormative role of rhetoric in communicating reason and constituting agency is also the focus of Remy Yurgo's book on neuroqueering rhetoric, Authoring Autism. How might neuroqueer theory and other crip theories and Filipino philosophy work together in a shared goal of queer cripping ideas such as reason, agency, rhetoric, and others that are so essential to Western philosophy's ideas of what constitutes self? For example, from listening to your presentation, the lucid sense of I experienced by some neurodivergents speak to the idea of loob and vice versa, although coming from very different places.
Thank you very much, Morgan. I actually just finished reading Authoring Autism, and it made me so happy. So I don't have a kind of firm answer on that, how they would work together. I mean, there are parallels in seeing like what is recognized as rhetoric, what is recognized as a kind of philosophy of mind or idea of the self. And what spoke to me a lot in Yorgo's work is the idea that again, to do away with the kind of idea of a spectrum, because that presupposes a kind of holistic point of view. So I think what I just said in answer to Julie can relate to that, like what is the yardstick we're using to measure this? But also I was really struck in Authoring Autism with the idea of deminess that they work. So very briefly, they're talking about demisexuality or demigender and things like that. But this idea that it's not a having, it is a kind of existing in a liminal space. And it is kind of a radical expression of fluidity and of both and. So I think that by looking, for example, at the importance placed on intuition in a very kind of practical kind of philosophy, a philosophy that is really embedded in how should we relate to one another, and what does intuition mean, and what does it mean to have concepts of intuition, and like what does it mean to think of intuiting essences in a very community-centered way. I think that has many, there's a lot to learn with like neurodivergent scholars and people and communities to think about, like, stop telling us that we don't have relations or that we don't have identities and that we don't self-relate, etc., because we do it differently. So I think there's a lot to exploit there for sure.
Great, thank you very much. This question is from Axel. I want to pick up on your last point. I think this was written earlier, so not just the last one, but a last one earlier. There is no tension in asserting that relations are morally good by default, even if there are oppressive relations, because all it entails is that solutions that sacrifice relationality are worse than those that fix it. And this must not be very controversial.
I mean, yes, this is a very good point, Axel. I hadn't thought about it that way. I was thinking of specific objections. I mostly work in bioethics, so I'm thinking Susan Sherwin, I'm thinking Susan Dodds, and lots of other people who, albeit like it might not represent, in fact, it does not represent the totality of feminist scholars on this issue, but that have expressed this idea that associating kind of moral goods with relationality and like not trying to destroy bad relations can be problematic. But I mean, I agree with you that we don't have to see relationality as a problem, but that is a way in which it is viewed by some pretty prominent people, and I think it's worth addressing.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Maeve O'Donovan. Thank you so much for your enlightening presentation and for doing so while dealing with a flare-up. I am so glad we didn't miss out on your important contributions. My question for you is about the practical nature of Filipino philosophy and philosophy of disability. In what ways do you think philosophy of disability benefits from emphasizing practical philosophy as a way of resisting all the things you identify as problematic? In other words, could Filipino philosophy serve as a model for the kind of philosophy we should be doing in addition to offering important alternative ways of thinking. We're running short on time, so yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I will do what I say to my students at the end of class with like, it is time. If you must leave, thank you for coming. If not, I will stay for a couple minutes. So briefly to answer that, I mean, I believe, yes, it should be a model. I also believe it's not the only model. Just in attending this conference, you can hear that there is a desire to say theory is great, but we have to look at the actual implications of theory and what it does. And my interest in looking at Filipino philosophy is that I'm not interested in saying, oh, it's great because it's not theoretical and not abstract, because I actually don't believe that. I believe, first of all, I'm speaking through language right now that is very abstract, but whatever. This idea that conceptualizing must look a certain way for it to count as conceptualizing and as theorizing. And as I said, like there are theories of Bait of this kind of essential intuition, but it is developed with different premises. So what's interesting for me is like, can we look at something that ostensibly most human beings care about, like who am I, what is my place in the world, how do I relate to others, in a way that uses a different vocabulary, a different conceptual vocabulary. And so it's less about like divesting myself from like, oh, I must erase everything I've learned from my Western training, and more about, okay, how can we effectively dialogue with other people?
Thank you so much, Elena. This has been a wonderful session, and I look forward to reading your work based on this presentation, and to continuing to follow your work as your career progresses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you, Helena and Julie, for chairing another wonderful session, and much there I had never come across before. I mean, almost all of it I'd never come across before. And I'm sure that's true for others too. So much to delve into.